podcast from CBS Sports.
And first pitch crushing. Deep left field. This is way back. Walk the walk.
Got a fantasy question? Email fantasybaseball@cbsi.com. Get ready to win your league.
Where fantasy becomes reality.
Now here's Frank, Scott, and Chris.
What's up, and welcome into Fantasy Baseball today on Wednesday, March 9th. I am Frank Stampfl, joined by Chris Towers. No Scott White as he's out drafting in some league called Tout Wars. I don't know. I've never heard of it. We'll get a full breakdown on tomorrow's podcast. I will reveal just one player he's drafted. Chris, are you ready?
Okay.
Are you following the draft yourself?
Yes.
Oh, darn it. Well, anyway, the player that I will reveal is Bartolo Colon.
That was a big pick. 10th round Bartolo Colon. No, it was earlier than the 10th round, right? It was a big pick. 10th round Bartolo Colon. Anytime you can get a value like that, in a pitching starved landscape like this, I think you got to be pretty happy with it.
Yeah, people are probably freaking out right now. What is going on? Did Scott really draft Bartolo Colon? No, that is a placeholder for Shohei Ohtani, the pitcher. So he is two different players in this league. He is a hitter. He is a pitcher. So Scott wound up with Shohei Ohtani, the pitcher, in round 10 as his SP5. Very interested to talk about Scott's draft on tomorrow's podcast. But today, it finally hit me. We talk about all these injured players all the time, basically. There's a lot of them going in the early rounds of drafts. They might not be injured right now. They might have been injured last year. But still, we have a lot of question marks early in our drafts. Why not get an actual expert on the topic in here to help us out? And that's exactly what we are going to do today, as Derek Rhoads is joining the podcast to talk about all of these injuries. What's going on, Derek?
Hey, man, thanks, Frank. I'm pumped to be here. This is like been listening to podcasts for a really long time, so it's fun to get to do this. I was geeking out with my wife, who was very tolerant of my geekiness. So I'm pumped. I'm excited. I really appreciate you guys reaching out, and looking forward to talk injuries, which can sometimes be depressing. But doesn't have to be.
Yeah, hopefully some good news in there as well. I've been following your work for a long time, and I encourage everybody to follow Derek on Twitter as well at DRHOA3. And he provides injury data for Baseball Prospectus and, of course, best ball content at Jag Fantasy. So a nice little, some nice niche content there. Injuries and best ball together, which, I think that's probably advice I would give to anyone who's trying to get into the fantasy space now is, man, try to find your niche and master that. But Derek, talk to me more about the injury data that you do provide to Baseball Prospectus.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of years ago, I guess it was really before last season, they kind of reached out. They had somebody who's kind of maintaining injury data for them, had needed to move on to another stop, and I had kind of been doing some injury analysis and had some injury tools out there, just kind of on my own for to share, because it was something I felt like there was kind of a need for easier access to historical injury data and stuff like that. And I use it, personally in my own, fantasy playing. So they just reached out and said, "Hey, we like that. Would you do that for us?" And I was like, "You mean for money?" And they said, "Yes." And I said, "Yes, I would definitely do that for you." So what I do is all the IL injuries I'm tracking, I'm categorizing, trying to get as much detail as we can. And we track that, internally, and then use that for articles, for research. Subscribers can see it on the player pages, things like that. So we try and make it as available as we can, so that, lots of different reasons people use it.
I like that you point out in your Twitter bio, Derek, that you are not a doctor, but do you consider yourself a Twitter doctor? Because I've noticed there are lots of those.
Yes. No, unfortunately, I have fallen into the Twitter doctor trap, and that every time it's a mistake. But no, I am not a doctor. I am actually an accountant by trade. I came at this because of the data side. I'm interested in data and data visualization. So that's actually kind of how I fell into the injury stuff. So I try and just rely on the data as opposed to any medical background. I try and pick up, there's lots of guys who are doctors who speak into this space, and I try and learn from them, but no, very much not a doctor. So I always think that's important to clarify, especially because my Twitter handle kind of makes it look like I'm a doctor.
Yeah, it's like Dr. HOA3. Who is that?
He's the doctor. Yeah. He's the homeowners association doctor for his
the third one
community. Yeah.
Yeah. The first two.
Yeah. Something bad happened.
It's dark. It's a dark story.
Before we get into the actual players, I've got a bunch of players written down. I do this thing where I really jam pack every single rundown, and most of the time we don't get to everything. But anyway, we'll get to the players. It's worth mentioning we're recording this around 10:15 p.m. Eastern time right now. So if any kind of breaking news happens regarding the MLB and the Players Association as they're currently meeting and well, not face-to-face anymore. I think they're just like calling each other up. Anyway, they're negotiating. There's lots of stuff going on, lots of proposals being thrown out there right now. So it seems like we're getting closer. I'm trying not to get too optimistic because I've already been crushed once before. I don't want it to happen again. But any breaking news, of course, we will get to here on the podcast.
I think the best way to think about it is like Schrodinger's cat, where like whether it's close or not, we won't know until it happens. Like there either is or is not a deal. And until Rob Manfred opens the box, we won't know if there's actually one. So that's the way I'm thinking. It's just there's no probabilities at play here. We'll just find out when we find out.
What's in the box? Do you know the movie, Chris?
That's a rare movie that you have seen, and that I have also seen that.
It's not an Adam Sandler movie, by the way, either. So I will point that out. We got a tweet.
It was 8 Crazy Nights, right?
Yes, that's it. Actually, I really do enjoy that movie. Anyway, let's get on to the players. We're going to discuss them in order of ADP. I guess, that's basically order of importance. So anyway, we'll start with the very top.
I just want to ask like some general questions, I guess, before we do get into it.
Do it.
How, like, this is, a data-centric approach, and that's something that I think is missing in a lot of the ways we talk about injuries, just because it's really hard to do. There's a lot of data. It isn't like we can just look at someone's player reference or baseball reference page and say he hit 37 home runs and this kind of injury information. It is available, but it's generally a little hard to find. I often go to a site called prosportstransactions.com, which is just this really like very basic, like I feel like it's like almost Web 1.0 kind of site where you can just search for like a player or an injury type and it'll just give you everything to a certain, I don't know exactly when, but that's been a super useful resource. But then you have to like get through all that data. And then one thing for me that, I kind of think about, and this is a thing that has influenced a lot of the way I write and analyze, is that like to a certain degree, injuries are kind of like the last black box in fantasy analysis. Like the industry as a whole is so sharp that it's really hard to find like when we're talking about busts or breakouts, it's really hard to find like, man, this guy's just obviously valued incorrectly. Like I think we all view Charlie Morton that way on FBT. But I think injuries are kind of like the last place where there's maybe inefficiency in the market a little bit. So I don't know how, like, as far as the data you have, I don't know how do you feel like, how does that help you in your, in your analysis or your play?
Yeah. And I would say that I think that in baseball in general, it is still one of the big black boxes. Like there is still a ton. People I've had the fortune to just meet a couple people who basically have said like baseball's behind. There is a huge wealth of information that is still to be learned about how to keep players healthy, best practices for returning and not having re-injury and things like, and that we're just like, that it's behind. And so then we're behind. And some of that's because it's a data problem, right? Like we find out, okay, player X has a strained shoulder. But that could mean a lot of different things. And teams will say strained shoulder and they don't always mean the same thing. And so you operate in this issue where we're, even when we do have the data, which we try to have, it's maybe not as clear as it could be. And so much of what I'm trying to do is use the data to create range of outcomes. So understanding that I'm working with imperfect data, and some of that's because it's limited to like my capacity, and some of that's because it's limited to what the teams give us. So whenever I try and do things, I try and say, okay, give my samples as big as I can, and try and create kind of ranges of reasonable outcomes that might occur, and then use that to kind of inform the way I think about things. I wish, there's some guys who have done some good work. Jeff Zimmerman over at Fangraphs has done a lot of good work in this space. And he would say, like, it is very challenging to try and nail down, like, predicting injuries in the fantasy space. Like, we can say, I feel it's risky. We can say, I think it's, but like, it is very hard to create models. It's just and evaluate.
It's the kind of thing, we've seen a lot of guys go from the fantasy space or the baseball writing space in general to work for teams. And like, if there was someone who was really, really good at predicting injuries, they probably wouldn't be doing it in the fantasy space publicly. They would probably be working for the Yankees.
Yes.
Or something like that. So it's,
I love how you pointed out the Yankees, Chris, because they got Giancarlo.
Well, they've got a lot of money. I feel like, but maybe the Rays or the Padres seem to like hiring writers. But yeah, that's I think that's and one of the other things I notice a lot with like the data side of it that can like complicate things. It's just like sometimes the same injury gets called multiple different things depending on the team. You'll have like one team call it a groin strain and one team call it an adductor strain, and it's like technically they're in the same area, and so they could both be right. Or like you said, with like a sprain or a strain, like a strain is technically a tear,
right? And
so you'll hear like, oh, he only strained his elbow, and it's like, well, that could mean a lot of different things. Right. So it's a difficult thing.
It's hard. Yeah, it's very hard, and that's I always just try and keep in mind that I'm working with imperfect data, and so I try and create, like I said, it's why I struggle sometimes. People are like, well, give me an exact. And I'm like, I can't give you an exact because number one, my data is not good enough. But number two, like the same injury can lead to completely different recovery times. It can lead to different, different outcomes. All these teams have different approaches to recovery. A lot of similarities, but like certain teams are going to have different approaches. Some are more aggressive, some are not. So I always try and think, okay, how can I make this kind of more of a probabilistic thought process? It's a thought process as opposed to like, I can't give you like percentages on a player likelihood, but I try and think of range of outcomes because, like you said, Chris, teams aren't great with data. And I try and go back, we get more clarity later, but there's so much information. Sometimes you just can't do it. There's going to be players we talk about tonight that we were told one thing and then we find out months later it's something completely different.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And let's start with the player at the very top, Fernando Tatis. He's the first overall player being drafted. His ADP is 1.2. And we know by now he had multiple shoulder subluxations last season, and he opted against surgery this offseason. And Derek, I feel like I've heard this from other sources already. Like, apparently this is something that can keep happening for Fernando Tatis. So is that something that you believe can happen? Like, is that very likely to happen this season? And if so, how worried are you about selecting him first overall in your fantasy baseball drafts?
Well, I think we can say with certainty that it's more likely for him than someone who doesn't have a history of shoulder instability, right? So, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's guaranteed or even likely for him to have another issue this season. I would say it's likely for him to have another issue at some point in his career, because what happens every time that happens, it basically kind of loosens things up, and it's more likely to happen again. The surgery is supposed to design to kind of like reset and restabilize, and hopefully can kind of like cut off the chain where it's kind of repetitively happening. But you can also do that through other methods. And we don't have a ton of details from Tatis. Like, we don't know, like, maybe he's getting some injections that, to help, foster some strengthening. Maybe he's doing a lot of, I'm sure he's doing a lot of work this off season to strengthen the shoulder and to try and just create some stability there. Like, that is a method of treatment. In fact, it's more common for like non-athletes, but because, people can take longer if they're normal folks. So I think you just have to have the right mindset with Tatis, which is I think he does have a higher risk than, Trey Turner for having a shoulder subluxation, right? Like, but it doesn't mean it's destined to happen. And I think you just need to kind of put that into your risk profile. So if you're going to take Tatis in the first round, I think you just be thoughtful as you move throughout the rounds and say, look, I want to kind of create a little more security, or at least the perception of security, with the understanding that even when Tatis was injured, played really well when he was on the field. And that's a benefit compared to maybe some other, and I think you could expect that, assuming he's able to get back on the field. I mean, he's shown an incredible toughness.
Yeah. Yep. Look, last season, even though he played 130 games, he finishes the 5th overall player in roto leagues last season. So it didn't affect his StatCast data. He still crushed the ball. Obviously, he's still incredibly fast. So that power speed combination, a batting average that is going to help you, of course, when it comes to Fernando Tatis. All reasons why he's still going first overall. And Chris, I believe that you are one of the people selecting him first overall. You did it in your Tout Wars draft.
Yeah, I'm willing to do it. Obviously, there is some risk, but it's the kind of thing where if he didn't have any injury risk, would there be any question about Fernando Tatis going number one? Or at least if he didn't have any, the way we talk about this is always a little fuzzy.
Right.
Like,
yeah, exactly.
Everybody has
our
injury
perception,
risk.
Right? Yeah.
If he didn't have more perceived injury risk than your average player,
right?
Would there be any question about him going number one? I don't think so. I just, given what he's done over the course of his major league career, I mean, we're talking about 3 seasons, but really kind of 2 full seasons worth of games, right around 300 games or so, maybe 280. And he's been like remarkably consistent across those games, even though there's been some like changes in the skill set. The strikeout rate has gone up and down. The BABIP has gone up and down. But we're talking about a guy who, over the first 273 games of his career, his 162 game pace is 48 homers, 31 steals, 292 average. 116 RBI, 125 runs. Like there's no question that a guy doing that at the age of 23 would be the number one. I mean, we're talking about, like, I think that's better than what Trout was doing at the same point in his career, at least in terms of fantasy production, which is, I mean, Trout's one of the best fantasy players ever. He's one of the best players ever. So that's the kind of place Fernando Tatis occupies in baseball right now. So I just think, like, even if you are discounting him for injury risk, I just still think he's so good that he kind of has to be up there. And, this does remind me one thing that I wanted to ask Derek before we moved on, was what are the kind of baseline, like if you have this data, what are kind of the baselines for like how often does a position player, because I've seen like starters, it's like 20% of them go on the IL in any given year. For starting pitchers, relievers, I would assume is probably around the same. Because I think a lot of the ways we tend to talk about this as, sports people in general is more like I said earlier, a player without injury risk. Well, every player has injury risk, and that depends on things that we don't know and things that we do know. And, every player has a chance of getting hurt in any given game, any given pitch, et cetera. And so it's like, to try to calibrate the way we think about those things is like, does everybody have a 15% chance of going on the IL and Fernando Tatis is 30%? That kind of thing is the way I think it helps to think about it.
Yeah, I don't have that at fingertips. I know that Jeff has done some of that work against Zimmerman, but mostly more for defining pitchers, easier to define pitchers. What I would say, when I'm looking specifically at hitters, what I'm concerned about, like, any hitter could get a hamstring strain just at the drop of a hat, right? But I'm not worried about those types of injuries as much as I am the injury that puts a guy out for the year. And there are very few injuries that are going to put a hitter out for the season. That's one of the good thing about hitters is, they're generally, injuries, even a 2-month injury would be a pretty serious injury for a hitter, maybe an oblique strain or something like that. And so that's where Tatis has a kind of a range of outcome that I don't think the average player has, because if he has shoulder surgery, we're not going to see him. Yeah. Versus the typical player, like we're going to talk about Acuña in a minute. Like, an ACL tear is actually pretty uncommon. It's a pretty uncommon baseball injury. And that's something you might see somebody out for a year. But most other hitter injuries, you're not expecting to lose a full season. So that's where I kind of go, that is a unique risk to him, I think, where it goes like, hey, the range of outcomes isn't just a month on the IL, it's the season. Yeah. And that, maybe I don't think the next guy has a very high risk of losing a season. So that's for hitters, that's kind of my calculus. It's like, well, anybody could miss, 2-3 weeks. But how many guys could miss 6 months, or how many guys consistently miss multiple months or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Ronald Acuña, who you just mentioned, and he tore his ACL on July 10th last year. He underwent surgery on July 22nd, and during the World Series, he said his timetable was May. He was having a conversation with Alex Bregman. Someone picked it up, and as a result, it was reported May was the target date for Ronald Acuña. Over the past month, Acuña's ADP is up to 9.2. He just went 4th overall in Scott's Tout Wars draft that he is doing tonight. So, Derek, what is your expected timeline, if you have one, for Ronald Acuña? And when would you actually select him? Just knowing the risk factors involved with him.
I've always kind of been like a late April. I thought he would just get a slow start to the season. I think if the lockout weren't happening, this is the kind of thing like this would be known. Like that we would know. Like we'd see what he's doing in spring training. And, this is the kind of thing that the lockout is killing this type of player, the player who's recovering from injury. And you can't, we can see him doing stuff and he's showing us videos, which we would only expect him to show good videos. We wouldn't expect him to show videos where like he's struggling or if something's gone wrong. But I my guess is Acuña is not going to be the one who's like pulling back. It'll be the team who sets his recovery pace. Like, it's going to be their comfortability. As I mentioned before, ACL injuries, not super, tears are not super common in baseball. I was looking through kind of like the last few guys that had it. Andrew McCutchen is a recent guy. Royce Lewis is recovering and is going to come back. He was out a really long time. The Twins have been really cautious with him. When I looked in 2018, Acuña had he bruised his knee and he had a mild ACL sprain, and it was very mild. He was back in like a month. When he came back at the end of June, and he stole 14 bases for the rest of the season, which is like a season-long pace of like 23-25. I think that is a reasonable expectation for 2021. Now he does, he's not the same player as he was in 2019 or 2018. The Braves know who he is. I think they kind of let him do more of what he wants to do now. We saw him, steal a ton of bases, right? But I think that we probably see a slightly slower pace of stolen bases, maybe a little less aggressive and kind of easing into it. But like, I think there's a chance he's back. I wouldn't be shocked, to be honest, if he's back by opening day. Like I could see it. I don't know that I would predict it, but like I could see it. The difference between April, 10th or whatever opening day ends up being and May 1st just isn't that. It's just not that big. I have taken him a few times lately because as the and I think you noted this, Frank, as the opening day gets pushed back, like you're kind of compressing the season. And I think a couple weeks, maybe that makes a difference. So I've kind of taken him right around the turn. But obviously he started to go higher than that. If it weren't for the stolen bases, I think you'd probably still see him in the second round, So I get it though. I think it makes sense. I think it's a logical way to approach it, but I would be a little surprised if he's as aggressive as he was in the last full season in 2019.
And I remember that previous knee injury that he suffered too. I believe that was his rookie season. And
it looked dark, right?
Yeah. Like his foot like slid across the base or something. And then it looked like, he kind of like jammed his leg into the ground. And I was like, oh man, because I drafted him everywhere as a rookie. And I'm like, I was all over Ronald Acuña, waiting for him to get called up. And then he got called up and eventually got hurt like a month later. And I was so worried, but then he came back and he was amazing. So I think that's, great, which you mentioned, 14 steals over the final couple of months. And obviously he's a better player now than he was then. So I think it's a good point there on Acuña. Chris, before we get into the next two outfielders here, Mike Trout and Mookie Betts, I know that you've been the Acuña guy, but where does he rank among that group? Acuña, Trout, Betts.
Ooh, I think I have him ranked last of that group. But that is also kind of context specific and team build specific and what you want to do. And but let me just make sure in Roto, he's just behind those guys. He's right around the 1-2 turn for me.
All right, I've got it. I've got a Trout Acuña Betts as of now, and
I've got Betts, Trout, Acuña.
It's yeah, I think you can ask a few different people and get different answers, obviously, depending on the expectation. But let's talk about Mike Trout, who the ADP is 11.6. So, over the past month, he's moved behind Ronald Acuña, and Trout suffered a calf strain in mid-May last year. He said he actually heard something pop in his calf and was expected to miss 6 to 8 weeks. He never returned last season. I found an article on The Athletic from late September where Trout said he was, quote, close to 100%, if not 100%, in late September. And he also went on to say, quote, once I talked to the trainers and talked to the front office and made the decision to shut it down, I kind of took a little bit of time off, and then I started doing things again. I started running. I started working out. I'm feeling great. I don't feel it at all. Again, that was in late September. However, Derek, it seems like Trout is still being pushed down, either with the concern over the calf injury or the fact that he just doesn't really steal bases anymore. So what is your concern level year over year when it comes to a calf injury, which seems pretty severe in hindsight?
Yeah, it definitely was severe. And it sounds like part of the issue was he was having some scar tissue after recovering that just wasn't healing the way they wanted to. And so that he was still having some discomfort, and they weren't happy with that. So that's why you could, because there was this point where it's like, oh yeah, he's almost back. He's almost back. He's almost back. It felt like that was like 6 to 8 weeks of that. There's not a long list of calf strains that have led to that much missed time. It's a pretty short list. Troy Tulowitzki is on that list. That's not a list you want to be on. Now the flip side to that is, it's not a long list. So it's not like we have a ton of, guys we can just point to and say, well, look what happened the next year. I think he would probably be a little more susceptible, maybe to some a lower leg injury, but my guess is they'll be also more cautious and more aware, and that maybe it just leads to a little rest here or something like that. I think the part of the concern with Trout, though, is kind of a pattern now. We've got a couple years now where we've seen some injuries and some missed time. And then you couple that with the fact that he's changing kind of his player profile. And then I think that's what people are just not really sure what to do with him. Chris, was he on the points league you guys drafted the other night? Was he on your team?
Yes,
I believe so. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's the type of team. I think that's the type of context where I am much more happily taking Trout. 12 teams, whether it be points or short rosters, with replacement, I think that makes a ton of sense. I get it in draft and hold or 15 team deep leagues with really shallow replacement level. I think, you might let that slip a little bit more, but I think there's no reason not to be aggressive in a format that has a nice replacement pool.
Yeah. And that was the thought process there. My outfield was Trout, Yelich, and I can't remember who the other one was, but it was a similar type of player. It was some that there are injury concerns about. And I think one thing that I tend to not be as concerned about injuries, just because like we talked about earlier, the fact that we don't know as much about them makes me think that it's an opportunity for market inefficiencies. But in that format, especially, Scott was saying on yesterday's podcast, you can, in a 12-team head-to-head points league with 3 outfield starting spots, you're going to find viable starters on waivers at any time. I mean, it's really the pool of available guys in that format makes it you're not going to get a 0 if Mike Trout misses time. And that's true in a roto league, but in, a 15-team league, especially where you might have to replace him with,
a negative player, quite frankly, a player
someone who might hurt you. Yeah. That's where it starts to get a little iffier, but in a head-to-head points league where you're going from, I don't know, maybe a projected 22 points a week from Mike Trout to 14 from the guy that you might pick up on waivers, that's not nothing.
Right.
But it's not a huge loss if it's only a couple weeks. Trout's an interesting one because, and there are a couple other players like this, and I think Byron Buxton has kind of become the poster child for this for me, where it's Trout does have this calf injury, which was serious. But before that, it was a lot of miscellaneous kind of nagging, smaller things where it's how much does that, how much should those kind of things happening to the same player multiple times when it's not the same injury? I always struggle with how to assess that risk. My sense is that type of risk is overblown, but I honestly don't know.
I think when it's disparate body parts, I am much less likely to be concerned. When I start like a pattern of like lower leg, like leg injuries, or a pattern of like a guy who constantly is getting hit by pitches and has like, hand issues, stuff like that. Like those to me are much more actionable, right? Like then like, oh, we had a finger issue one year and then a heel issue another year. And then he had a hamstring strain the next year. It's like, those don't mean that much to me, especially for hitters.
Or like with Buxton, a big issue for him in his career was just he couldn't stop running into the outfield wall. And that he's had concussion issues as a result of that. And something that the Twins have. Well, yeah, and then he moves really fast. And so something that the Twins started doing last season in 2020 actually was he's playing shallower than before. And so they're basically saying you're such a good defensive player that we're going to play you shallower to take away some of that risk. We're going to tell, he's actively making a decision to play less aggressively near the wall. And so my hope is that it will help him stay healthy. Last season, obviously, he then had a hip injury and got hit by a pitch.
Yeah, right. It's so unfortunate, too, because you'll have people that say, oh, well, look at Buxton and Corey Seager. They were hurt again last year. They're injury prone. It's like, dude, they broke their hands because they got hit by pitches.
Yeah, that's the thing that's tough is like Byron Buxton's been hit by a pitch 17 times in 493 games. We're not talking about Derek Dietrich here, a guy who's like leaning over the plate or something. That's not a part of his game. There are some guys who Anthony Rizzo gets hit by a lot of pitches. That's part of his game.
Sure does. That's
not Byron Buxton. And so it's frustrating. I don't know what to do.
Yep.
I'm just going to keep drafting him.
He's like the extreme to me. I don't think I would ever like anybody who holds Buxton up as an example one way or the other. I just go like, I don't think we should make rules based off of like this guy who is clearly an outlier one way or the other. He's either the most unlucky guy ever or he's the most injury prone guy ever. But either way, it's hard to make a rule, some kind of, rule for drafting based off of him.
Yeah.
Yep. Let's wrap up this trio of outfielders. Mookie Betts has an ADP of 13. He dealt with a hip injury for a large portion of last season. He wound up getting a cortisone shot in July. Ultimately, it was a, quote, down year for Mookie Betts where he hit 264 with 23 homers and 10 steals. Betts opted not to have hip surgery in the offseason and apparently is feeling much better. Derek, how worried are you about this hip injury lingering for Betts as he moves closer to 30 years old?
Yeah, I'm not overly worried. So the issue was a bone spur, and from what I understand, and having listened to other folks and done some reading, the issue that can come up is it gets irritated, and then when it gets irritated, it gets inflamed, and that's when you have to do something. You can actually go a long time with a bone spur, and if it doesn't bother you, great, everything's hunky dory. And a lot of times, as long as there's not that inflammation, things might be hunky dory, which is probably why he didn't elect surgery, because once they got the inflammation under control, he's feeling comfortable. As long as that we don't see that irritation again, which it could happen, I think we could probably see a healthy Betts season. If it does happen again, I think we'd probably see what we saw last year, which was kind of managing it. That's not a bad worst case scenario. It's certainly not what you want, but I think we kind of saw what playing through that injury looks like. And if that's kind of your floor, I don't think that's a bad place to live, knowing that there's a ceiling beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, he did what he did last year. Look up how many games he played, but
it was 122 games. The pace for 162 was like 30 homers, 115 runs, 80 RB, 75 RBI, 15 steals. Like, it was still a pretty awesome season. And the thing with Betts is we've seen something very similar from him before in 2017, very similar overall production. And he came out and had a historically great season the next year. Now, that's not to say that will happen, but it is to say that I'm not personally all that concerned about Mookie Betts.
Derek, you're on the clock at pick 10. All three of these outfielders are available. Ronald Acuña, Mike Trout, Mookie Betts. Who are you selecting?
Roto League, I'm taking Acuña. Points, I'm taking Trout. Betts is probably pretty. I'd rather take the other two over Betts. And especially at 10, like I'll just if Betts falls to the second round, give me that. But that's where I'm at with the other two.
All right. Before we get to some pitchers, Jacob deGrom, most notably, I want to remind everyone to join our Fantasy Baseball Today Facebook group. It's a fun community asking a bunch of different questions every single day. There's player analysis, there's dynasty, there's keeper questions, you name it. They ask it. People looking for leagues, people offering leagues, joining new leagues. So it's really fun, and make sure to check it out. And feel free to join facebook.com/groups/fantasy baseball today. We're going to take a break. When we return, Jacob deGrom here on Fantasy Baseball Today. All right, so let's talk about deGrom. His ADP is 21.2, and he is a freak. He's far and away the best pitcher on the planet on a per-inning basis. The problem is he's missed time due to neck, lat, back, shoulder, forearm, and elbow issues over the past 2 seasons. He was eventually shut down last year with UCL inflammation. And, Derek, I have Jacob deGrom ranked as my SP7, but the truth is I really don't even give much thought to drafting him when he's the top pitcher available. I tend to be risk averse, at least in the early rounds. And as a result, I'm just not winding up with any Jacob deGrom. What say you?
This is a guy who's impossible because, like, if he's healthy, he's not pitching. He's pitching 200 innings. He's the number 1 pitcher in baseball. And it looks silly to have not drafted him. If he has a season beyond just nagging, if he misses a season, then it's like, well, you idiots, you shouldn't have drafted him. And I think to pretend that we know which one of those outcomes is going to happen is silly. I don't even know if we can really predict which one's more likely. I think the problem is what we'll do is we'll project for 140 innings, which is the middle. But the reality is I don't think that's likely. I think we either see all the innings or very few of the innings. But so Frank, my thing is I'm the same way. I've not drafted him unless I auto drafted him on accident. And I've got a couple of those shares, and I will brag about those if he pitches 200 innings. But generally speaking, I just don't like that. That's my range of outcomes. That I see a world where maybe it's a 25 to 30% chance that I get less than 100 innings, and that's not an outcome I want from a guy I'm drafting in the 3rd round, or depending on your league.
Yeah, it was 92 innings pitched for Jacob deGrom last year. Chris, I know that we're obviously still waiting for more information to come out. We need spring training to find out more information. This is another one of those players where if pitchers and catchers reported in the middle of February, we would have a lot more information on Jacob deGrom, and it would be a lot easier to analyze him. But where have you settled? I know that early in the offseason you really kind of liked the idea of drafting him, and then you kind of soured. So where are you at now?
A very soft SP3, but it's kind of there's a band where he's, actually SP3 to SP7 or something. And I don't know if in any given draft, I would actually have the courage to take him there. And it ultimately comes down to your personal level of risk tolerance. And some people are more willing to take on risk or more willing to build their team in a way that can overcome some of that risk. And in deGrom's case, I think you can look at it one of 2 ways. You can look at it and say, well, the baseline level of injury risk for every pitcher is super high relative to hitters, especially. And
you said it was 20%, just give or take.
I believe historically, 20% of starting pitchers end up on the IL. It could be higher than that actually. But yeah, he certainly has risk. But you look at last season, Shane Bieber was this guy who we were oh, he's a rock. He's going to throw 200 innings. He's one of the best bets for 200 innings. And then he gets a shoulder injury and he barely pitches. And so it's always tough. Garrett Cole in 2016 had right elbow inflammation. There were concerns that he was going to need Tommy John surgery. He was someone people weren't touching for a year or 2 after that. And then he pitched 200 innings pretty much every season after that. So it's always so tough when it comes to pitchers because anytime you're investing in pitchers at a high level like this, anytime you're taking a pitcher in the 2nd round or 3rd round, you're inviting a significant amount of risk onto your team, more than any hitter you could probably grab. Maybe that's not true of Garrett Cole versus, I don't know, Fernando Tatis or someone. But even then, I would say probably Garrett Cole has a similar chance of suffering a serious injury. That's just the nature of pitching and the way the elbow joint works when you're putting that kind of strain on them. And so it's really hard. I think I'm out on Jacob deGrom at the place where I have him ranked, which is a weird thing to say and probably means I need to move him down. But I I can't bring myself to move Jacob deGrom down below Zach Wheeler. Like, that seems stupid. I think Zach Wheeler's good, but like, Jacob deGrom is putting together one of the best stretches by a pitcher ever in the history of baseball. We're talking like not Pedro Martinez in the late 90s, early 2000s, but Greg Maddux in the mid 90s, Sandy Koufax in the late 60s. Like this is the level that he's pitching at. And so it is.
I was going to say, Chris, like that, like the one, if you were going to make the argument for Jacob deGrom, and I'm not sure I have the intestinal fortitude for it, but like there is no skills risk. If he is the safest skills player in the draft, I think we can say with confidence. Like even Garrett Cole, we'd look and go, well, what if the home runs go crazy? Like there's this Jacob deGrom does not have that. So if he's healthy, I think we can speak with a level of certainty about him that probably we can't with any other player.
Yeah.
There's something to be said for that. I haven't had the guts to go into that, but like I think there is something to be said for that.
Yeah, look, he is the ultimate, I would say, in the first 2 rounds, risk-reward player, because if he even gives you 160-plus innings, he's likely the number 1 player in fantasy baseball. Not just pitcher. We're talking player, the best player in fantasy baseball. So if you can stomach that risk, then Jacob deGrom is the player for you. I'll point out that someone left a comment on YouTube recently, and they said if you just put Tyler McGill's production with Jacob deGrom, based on the 92 innings that you got from Jacob deGrom, if you just combine those, it was the number 1 pitcher in fantasy.
that's not surprising. Yeah,
it's kind of crazy to think about, but that's just how good he is. Let's talk about a multitude of shoulder injuries here, Derek. And you kind of mentioned at the top, like shoulder injuries are not created equal. Obviously, it depends on the pitcher, and there's like a bunch of different things going on in the shoulder. But we'll start with Shane Bieber, and he's got an ADP of 25.8. He's going just after Jacob deGrom. He was limited to just 16 starts last season. He missed over 3 months from June to September with a shoulder strain. Don't know exactly what kind. You could tell us more about that. But he returned for his final 2 starts. Velocity was down. He typically sits 92, 93 with the fastball. He averaged around 91 miles per hour with the fastball. Are you willing to invest an early 3rd round pick on Shane Bieber, knowing what we know right now?
Yeah, I don't have a huge issue with it. So just to speak to his injury a little bit, and this is a great example of a time when you should seek out the medical folks, because they can give you a level of granularity about these injuries that I can't, as far as like, well, which part of the shoulder. And Nick Savali on Twitter did a good deep dive on Shane Bieber, where he talked about the type of strain it was. It's a subscapularis. I'm going to mispronounce that. And you guys, internet, you can have fun with that. But it's a type of strain that isn't, you don't worry about it as much as like, say, a rotator injury. My bigger concern is not that his velo didn't come back, because I think you could say, well, they didn't ramp him up, whatever. His velo was down before he got hurt, and that concerns me. He was down a mile per hour from where he was in 2020. So 2019 we have the good season, 2020 we have the insane season, and then 2021 we step back down to the 2019 velocity. I think that the 2019 season is where your expectation should be, which is still a very good player, and I think would be worthy of a 3rd round pick. And so like I don't have an issue. I've got a few shares, not a ton, but I don't have a huge issue with that, and I'm not overly concerned about a recurrence of the injury. His team's not very good. I don't feel like I feel like there's some concern about what he'll have around him, which is why I think the 3rd round, why people aren't like maybe in love or thrilled. But I don't think the injury should be what's holding you back.
All right, so just to give people an idea of what he did in 2019, Shane Bieber, 3.28 ERA, a 105 WHIP. He had 259 strikeouts, over 214 and a third innings pitched. Obviously, I don't know that we're expecting more than a handful of pitchers to go 200 plus innings, obviously. But the ratios and the strikeouts were fantastic for Bieber.
The thing that I struggle with Bieber and Derek, you brought up with Jacob deGrom, there's no skills risk. With Bieber, I do think there is some, because, and I've talked about this a lot, but I just feel like he's kind of, it's not like a super razor thin knife. It's not like the Japanese knives. It's maybe more like, I think the German knives aren't quite as sharp. They're cut at a different angle, but it's like, because he gets hit so hard, so consistently, I always feel like if there's just like a minor diminishment in terms of his skill set, things could go really wrong really quickly for him. And I don't mean really wrong in like a 5 ERA or anything,
Yeah,
but it's
right.
like I could easily see Shane Bieber having a pretty normal season where he has like a 4 ERA just because he's on the wrong side of variance on home runs and doubles. And just, that's the concern for me, is that we're chasing a lot of upside with him. And I do think there's the production and injury risk there. Although the way you talk about it, the shoulder injury being not so much of a rotator cuff, but I was looking it up. It's more like in the back of the shoulder. Maybe that is reason for less pessimism than I was thinking. So that's an interesting thing to bring up.
Yeah. For what it's worth, Shane Bieber tweeted recently that he's been 100% for a while now. So another one where, once spring training ramps up, we'll get more information. If he's looking good in spring games and velocity is where it should be, 92, 93, where he typically has been. I agree with you, Derek. Like, I think in the shortened season, he was averaging 94 on the fastball.
Yeah.
He knew he was making 12 or 13 starts basically. And he was able to just kind of like leave it all out there and go like max effort on his fastballs, where I don't think that's something you should expect from him.
The level of competition in 2024,
right.
Cleveland Guardians in particular, was famously quite low. As people who drafted Zach Plesac last season learned.
Hey, let's just lump the AL Central together, right? Kenta Maeda, another one who was fantastic that season. So Maeda and Zach Plesac, 2 names there. Derek, I'm going to throw 2 more names your way here. Carlos Rodon has an ADP of 106.4. He has a history of shoulder trouble. He missed some time last year because of it. He averaged around 96 miles per hour with his fastball his first 20 starts, and then he was down around 93 over his final 4 starts. The other name here is Pablo Lopez, has an ADP of 121.2. He hit the IL last season with that dreaded right rotator cuff strain, and it's now the 3rd serious shoulder issue he's dealt with in the last 4 years. So I think 2 guys that when they're on the mound, they're both really good. There's a lot of talent there, but both have pretty significant injury risk. What do you think about Rodon and Pablo Lopez?
Yeah, this comes to a tolerance standpoint and a team building standpoint for me. You should expect both of these players to miss time. Like not like they might miss time. Like you should plan that they miss a chunk of the season. With Rodon, I think it's harder to know how much of the season, because he's a player who's kind of changed a little bit over time. He threw harder in 21 than he had in previous seasons. He threw really hard for a good chunk of the season. But you kind of just see the straight line at a certain point. Like he peaks and then his velocity just declines as the season goes on. His injuries, it's like shoulder fatigue, shoulder soreness, shoulder inflammation. So like there's obviously shoulder issues. The team didn't just jump on him after that season, which to me tells me, hey, not that they may not, they may still do it after, lockout, but they weren't right on it. And so there's risk there, and you need to understand that. And, I think there's a risk that he pitches like 50 innings, or there's a risk that he does what he does last year, which he pitches most of the season great and then wears down. And you just have to be ready to kind of accept that that range of outcomes. Pablo Lopez, I think the range of outcomes is a little more set in that, he, as much as he has had injuries that have derailed every season, he's also kind of stayed in a range of innings. He's been between like 100 and 130 innings for like all of the last 4, if you combine across the minors for the last 3 full seasons, he's like 120, 125, 108. So if you run your projections, you need to set, a Pablo Lopez projection, like most likely outcome at like 125, 130 or something like that. And then anything you get above that, great. Wonderful. Maybe the shoulder stays healthy for a season, but you probably shouldn't expect it to. So I don't, the style of leagues, because I played best ball and you can't replace guys, I don't draft these kind of guys. Now we're getting into the season where you have replacement level, you have maybe IL slots. I think it's a very different calculus, and I think they're much more tolerant in those type of leagues.
All right, Chris, I personally have Pablo Lopez ranked ahead of Carlos Rodon this year. I understand how amazing Rodon was last season. I'm just a little bit more worried about the injury risk, which Derek obviously touched on there. Even though he's going 15 spots later in ADP, give me Pablo Lopez over Rodon.
I do think Rodon's the better pitcher. I think Pablo Lopez is good, but the good version of Carlos Rodon, the version that we saw last season, is I mean, I don't think it was like a fluke that he was one of the best pitchers in baseball when he was healthy. I think he legitimately was that good. The problem is, I'm looking at his four-seam fastball for his career, and it was the highest of his career, 95.4 miles per hour at average velocity. It was even higher than that before the last 4 starts. His whiff rate against his fastball was 29.7%. His xWOBA allowed was 280. Those are absurdly dominant numbers. Those are like Brandon Woodruff has one of the best swinging strike rates on his fastball. He's usually in that range. And so that was a big part of what made Carlos Rodon so effective last season was he had always been someone who the slider was really good and he just needed to figure out what the second pitch was. And it was like, well, if he gets a changeup, last season it was just his fastball was so dominant that he didn't need a good changeup. If his fastball is not that effective, I don't think the overall package is anywhere near as impressive. And he just he basically hasn't been healthy at all the last like 4 or 5 seasons. And so I think he, like Derek said, he's someone you're expecting to miss time. You're not like, well, there's a risk. He's going to miss time. That's the issue.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue that. I think, Carlos Rodon at his best is better than Pablo Lopez. I guess depends what you want at that point in your draft. If it's upside, then Carlos Rodon. If you want, a higher floor type pitcher, Pablo Lopez is probably the one that you want to chase there. But I think the total package, the injury risk, the high floor, I prefer Pablo Lopez over Carlos Rodon myself. We got about 10, 15 minutes left here, Derek. So I'm going to try and rattle off and go through as many of these players as we could possibly get to. Sixto Sanchez, obviously there's a bunch going on here. He had shoulder surgery last July to repair a capsular tear. He's expected to return sometime mid-season. Is he somebody worth stashing in an IL spot this year, or would you just stay away?
No, I think you just got to stay away. And that sucks because Sixto Sanchez is an exciting player. But I don't think you can wait this one out because they're already saying middle of the season, all it takes is one little thing and then he's shut down for the year.
Yeah. Sticking with the shoulders here, Jack Flaherty, Logan Webb, and John Means, they all dealt with shoulder injuries in season last year. Again, not all shoulder injuries created equal. Anything especially worrisome with this group? Flaherty, Webb, John Means.
Probably Logan Webb of the two I'm more concerned about, not necessarily the injury, but the fact that he had the injury and then he also had his highest innings pitched by a pretty significant margin. Last year, he pitched 150 innings. I think his previous high was maybe 100 innings. So that doesn't mean he's guaranteed to be hurt next year, but we could have been seeing somewhere, and maybe he's just, it was a middle of the season injury, so it wasn't like the end of the year where he kind of just crapped out. Just hey,
he was better than ever at the end of the
right, exactly. So, but he's the guy of the two where I go maybe, or of the three, maybe this is the one I worry about a little bit more. But I'm not overly worried about any of those guys. And Flaherty, he had an oblique that then he gets injured the shoulder, and the shoulder came right after the oblique. He never really seemed like he was healthy. I think it's very reasonable to think that there was related. When he came back, his velo was down, and then he goes on the injury, IL with the shoulder injury. I'm not worried about him. John Means, he's got a few different things in his injury history, little things here and there. He's had some shoulder stuff, nothing that's kept him out for a long time, but he's also never pitched 200 innings, and some of that's because of his skills, not his health. But I'm not overly worried about his health.
All right, let's get to a few more of these. Charlie Morton. Now, Derek, this will determine whether or not you're allowed back on the podcast ever again. The ADP for Charlie Morton is 88.2. He broke his fibula on a comebacker in the World Series, expected to be ready for spring training. And he recently told David O'Brien of The Athletic that he's, quote, mostly caught up to where he would normally be at this point in the offseason. If he's healthy, he seems criminally undervalued. What do you think, Derek?
I when I was reading the rundown, I was like, oh, this is the one I'm out on more than I think you guys are. And it's not because I think he's bad, because I do think he's very good, and it's incredible. I think he still has this stigma from years ago, which is nuts because he's been throwing 95 miles an hour for a while now, right? And he's been extremely talented the last few years. I am a little nervous the fact that he is still talking about being mostly red. He's being very cautious with his words. And I think he went on to say in the interview, well, we'll see what the team says when the team sees me. Things like that make me go, it could just be an older guy who just knows the game and it's just look, I'm not going to hype things up. Or it could be a guy who goes, I know that I'm going to have to ease into this season, and it may be a late start for him. That's the way I read it. it is a pretty big surgery. I mean, or a pretty big injury that he's coming off of. And I think sometimes we can be like, oh, it's a bone issue. Maybe let's not worry about that. But like Bellinger had, a fracture that lasted a super long time, longer than we expected. Like things can still happen even when it's not muscle related. So I'm a little more cautious. I think where he's going is a reasonable place considering the injury plus the age. I mean, he's not a young man. And so I think that's a pretty good spot. And if you like Morton, just take the value and walk on down the road.
All right, Derek. Well, it was nice knowing you. We will
we'll see you later.
I knew it. I was glad. I wanted to wait till the end of the podcast, to really get that in, trying to get as much as I can, much airtime.
I knew we should have led with Charlie Morton. Chris, I think that's the reason, right? Like we've talked about this recently. Why are we so much higher than everybody else on Charlie Morton in the industry? And I think that's probably a reasonable explanation.
Yeah, maybe it's just because I've never broken a bone. Maybe that's it. I don't know what goes into it. Maybe that's just we're those outliers where we just don't know how hard it is.
Yeah, perhaps. Let's talk about some Tommy John recoveries here. Obviously, Justin Verlander, another not so young man, ADP 107.6. He's kind of in a category of his own when it comes to these Tommy John recoveries. He had TJ back in October of 2020. He's now 17 months removed from the surgery. Derek, the last time we saw Verlander in a full season, he finished as the #1 overall player in 2019. What are your expectations, and do you find yourself investing at this cost?
I have not drafted much Verlander. I'm not really opposed, but it just seems like there's always been somebody in the room who's a little more interested in him than I am. Here's an example of the type of risk I don't like taking, though, is with the guy who has both health and skills. When you talk about, we saw what he made, he pitched 6 innings in 2020. We haven't seen him pitch since the 2019 season, and 2 years at his age, that's not nothing. Now, Houston re-signed him after seeing him come back. So to me, that's an encouraging sign. They saw enough there. They go, look, this is a guy we will gladly bring back into the organization. So I think that he will probably be pretty good. I think that, again, you have some concern at his age. How many innings are we going to see? Will we 100, will we see that same quality? Especially because coming off the 2019 season, he was talking about changing his mechanics and he was just doing tweaking, and you don't like to hear that off a guy coming off one of his best seasons. So again, I think he would be another example of a dude. If we saw spring training, I think you would either be super in on him or super out on him because we would know so much more.
Yeah. 198 mile per hour fastball.
Right. Yeah. No, exactly. Yep. You're exactly right.
Whereas it's not that's not the case for Jacob deGrom for me.
Right.
Just because for me, it's not really a question of what does Jacob deGrom look like right now. It's a question of can he stay healthy, which it's a question of both for Justin Verlander, but specifically, he has to get past that first barrier. And I think his value would jump if we saw him look like him.
Which is different for those other guys that you're about to mention.
Yeah. Let's talk about those guys. There's a trio in Luis Severino, Mike Clevinger, and Noah Syndergaard going between picks 160 and 200. Do you find yourself gravitating towards any of this group, Derek?
Not one. And I think that it's not that you can't. I just think that I just don't like that there. There's other guys who I think have a profile that may not be as high a ceiling, but certainly is higher floored. You don't necessarily always want to draft for floor. If I was forced to pick between those 3 guys, it's probably Clevinger for me. Maybe just above Severino. Syndergaard, I'm out on. The only concern with Clevinger, there's just so much. The concern with Clevinger to me is we saw the big velo jump and then we saw injuries happen. So maybe he goes back down to the velo. Will we see a dip in skills? So that's wishy-washy.
Yeah. Chris, I know that you typically target this group. You drafted Severino the other day, but how do you rank that group? Severino, Clevinger, or Syndergaard?
I think it's actually that order. Severino, I like more in where I drafted him the other day, which was in that points league. Just because he's got that SPARP eligibility. It's a shallower format, so you can replace him if need be, especially at an RP spot because there's going to be a closer available in that format. So that's where I like Severino best. I do have them Severino, Clevenger, Syndergaard. Yeah, Severino, it's a shoulder and an elbow that he's missed time with now. He hasn't pitched really since 2018. He was indisputably an ace for 2 full seasons before that. So I think the upside's significant, but yeah, when I do draft these guys, it tends to be after this this range when they fall, except for with Severino in that points league, just because prices were out of control in that league anyway.
Yeah, right. All right. So, Derek, I'm going to just rattle off a bunch of names here, and you can give me like you're either in or out and like whatever, 10, 15 second analysis on each of them. Christian Yelich with the back injury last year and Cody Bellinger 1 year further removed from the shoulder surgery. What do you think about these two in or out?
In Bellinger, out. Yelich, more skills than health.
All right. Clayton Kershaw. Clayton Kershaw has the forearm and the elbow. He's obviously spent a bunch of time on the IL the past 6 seasons. He's now 34 years old. Did not receive the qualifying offer from the Dodgers. In or out, Clayton Kershaw?
Way out. Couldn't be farther out.
Well, that's perfect because I just spent $42 on him in the Scott.
No.
This is like a really unique format, Derek, where it's a 24-team head-to-head points league, and all but like 10 viable starting pitchers were kept in this league. So
that doesn't even matter. It's not real money.
Frank's in a rebuild, so it's probably like if he gets 3 healthy weeks out of Clayton Kershaw, it's time to trade him.
Trade him. Yeah, that makes sense.
100%. Alex Bregman is coming off wrist surgery in November. Anthony Rendon had hip impingement surgery in mid-August. In or out in those two?
In Bregman, but I would like to make sure that he's healthy for spring training. Rendon, I don't like the fact that they're still uncertain. Like the language they're talking about Rendon is like he should be ready or will probably be ready for spring training. I don't like the way that they're talking about that. I'd like to see what they said with Trout is 100% healthy, will be ready. I don't like that they're couching that with Rendon.
All right, Max Muncy, partially torn UCL, and he revealed earlier this week that rehab has been going well. He's swinging a bat. Plan is to be ready for opening day, but he won't know for sure how his body reacts until he plays in actual games. Max Muncy, in or out?
I am out, but I understand why people are in, and I don't think they're crazy. I'm just not.
Music
it's so hard. They're just the thing. Like we just don't have very much. Like this is one of those injuries that we just don't have much to go on. It's a hitter Tommy John or hitter torn UCL that's not having Tommy John surgery in his non-throwing arm. So it's like, is it likely to impact his swing? Very possibly. I don't know. Shohei Ohtani was really good playing through the same thing in his rookie season, but it's also what's the re-injury risk? I don't know because it's not his throwing arm. So was it a fully torn UCL? I don't know.
I mean, it's not that he injured it in the first place though, right? So like the fact that it's not his throwing arm doesn't mean that he will, that he definitely can't re-injure it. My thing with Muncy is going to just longer than 15 seconds, but is that again, the range of outcomes is 0 and a full season. And there aren't very many hitters that have that. I would have felt better had he gotten the procedure that we saw Rhys Hoskins get a few years ago, which is a new procedure to treat torn UCLs and it's the internal brace procedure and really quick recovery times, relatively speaking. But I understand if doctors aren't recommending it, you shouldn't get it. But I would have felt better had we seen that. And we saw Rhys Hoskins get that one, in the offseason, then come back at the beginning of the year. I'd feel a little bit better. So I just don't like that uncertainty.
Well, let's talk about Rhys Hoskins, who had surgery to repair a tear in his lower abdomen in late August. The recovery time was 6 to 8 weeks. In or out, Rhys Hoskins?
I'm in. There was a million guys who had lower abdomen, sports hernia, like core surgery issues. I think there's literally I don't know, 7 or 8 guys that had that that type of surgery at the offseason. I'm mostly in on those guys.
Well,
Hoskins being one.
I think that means you might be in on DJ LeMahieu, who had a sports hernia surgery right after the season. What do you think?
Yep, I'm in on him.
All right, Zach Gallen and Lance McCullers. I wrote on the rundown elbow/forearm stuff. So that usually sounds bad. What do you think about those two?
Mm-hmm. In on Gallen, out on McCullers. I think if you're in on Gallen, though, you do need to recognize that it's not super clear that it's 100% no problem. But he did come back from his forearm issues, was throwing the same. His velocity was there. His pitch mix was mostly there. So
tons of pitches.
Yeah. So like they moved him. So I feel pretty good about Gowan. I will not draft McCullers at all.
All right. Matt Chapman had surgery on his right hip labrum late in 2020. He was quite bad last year. Do you think a further year removed from the surgery can help Matt Chapman?
I hope so. I was kind of in last year, coming off the hip surgery. I thought he was going to be all right. And so I took the L there on that one. I think that if he's bad this year, it's not because of the hip.
All right. Yeah. I mean, lots of strikeout risk, obviously, right. And just overall talent risk.
The one concern for me with the hip was that his defense was worse last season by most measures. Yeah. So that's the one place where it's like, okay, maybe he wasn't 100%, but that doesn't make me that doesn't necessarily tell me whether he'll be 100% this season or whether this is kind of a new baseline.
Alex Kirilloff, someone who Scotty Dubs does like quite a bit himself, had a wrist surgery late last season. The recovery timeline was 8 weeks, and I believe this is something he's dealt with dating back to his days in the minors. In or out on Alex Kirilloff?
I have no idea. My opinion, the injury is not what I'm worried about. I don't know how I feel about him as a player. He's a guy who I don't know what to think. So I'm not out because of the injury, but I don't have a real strong opinion on him as a player.
All right. I've got a bunch of late round options here, so I'll just throw them all your way. And if there's one or two that you particularly like, either stashing or to start the season, feel free. Let me know. Carlos Carrasco had surgery to remove a bone fragment in his elbow. Jamison Tyone coming back from ankle surgery. Steven Strasburg had thoracic outlet. Zach Eflin had knee surgery in September. Nate Pearson had a sports hernia. Mike Soroka coming back again from the Achilles. Seth Beer, he's the only hitter of this bunch, had shoulder surgery because of a dislocation. Do you like anyone from that group?
I like Carrasco. I think that he's finally fallen late enough that it reflects kind of his year in, year out injury issues. And that particular surgery doesn't bother me. I don't like Strasburg coming off thoracic outlet at his age. That's a really challenging recovery. I worry a ton about the velocity. I don't understand why I feel like people are more positive on Zach Eflin than I am. I think he could miss multiple months of the season. I
haven't really heard much.
We haven't heard much. The surgery, like they were talking, I thought I had some in my notes that they mentioned after the surgery that it would be a pretty long recovery. So, and he dealt with knee issues before. So, I'm not feeling real great about Eflin.
All right, Chris, is there anyone that you find yourself targeting from this group? I've drafted a bunch of Carrasco already. So,
and don't draft Mike Soroka.
That's the one that makes me
to be good. But
that's the one that makes me the most sad, just because Achilles injuries are so tough for professional athletes. And we've seen some success stories around other sports. We've seen, Cam Akers came back in 5 months. Kevin Durant has basically looked like himself. That's something that Achilles injuries used to, if they didn't end your career, you came back generally as a much diminished version of yourself. A torn Achilles. There really were not very many success stories. I want to say Dominique Hawkins was one of the few success stories before like the last 5 or so years. And Soroka's going through it twice. Now I think
it's much worse. The second recovery rates are much lower the second time.
Adam Wainwright did tear his Achilles, right?
I think it was a different injury. I know. Okay. Yeah. I don't want to say, I can look it up if you guys want to vamp, but if not, it's okay.
Yeah. It was a torn Achilles in 2015, out 9 to 12 months. So I don't know exactly what the distinction would be, but obviously I think the second time, because from what I understand about the Achilles injuries, the ruptures, the really bad thing is that you just can't do anything while you're recovering. And so one of the big risks is like muscle atrophy. If you look up pictures of like Elton Brand after he ruptured his Achilles, you can see noticeably, and there obviously aren't a lot of baseball examples of this. Ryan Howard's another one.
Right.
But Elton Brand's, whichever calf he ruptured his Achilles on, is noticeably smaller than the right one. It's just because you can't do anything for like 6 months. It's really, really tough to recover from. So I would expect coming off of it twice in, a 16-month span is probably going to make it even tougher for Soroka.
And a shoulder injury in between those two things. So, it's just not great.
It's so tough for Soroka too. I loved him coming up too. He was awesome to watch. He's so crafty and he put together that breakout season. So I would say for those in dynasty or keeper leagues, as Soroka's getting closer to returning and, there's optimism building and people getting excited. Yes, we get to see Mike Soroka pitch again. Try and shop him. See if you can just kind of trade him away for, I would say, not anything, but like if you can get value for Mike Soroka, then yeah, I would definitely.
I would say something similar about Nate Pearson. It's been so many different things. He's pitched so little as a professional since getting drafted that it feels like it's so hard to see how it comes together for him.
Yeah. You want to know why I spent $42 on Clayton Kershaw in the Scott White Dynasty League? It's because I have Nate Pearson on my team. So there's that. He is Derek Rhoads. Make sure you follow him on Twitter at DRHOA3. Provides injury data for Baseball Prospectus and, of course, best ball content at Jag Fantasy. Derek, we appreciate you so much, man.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. Loved coming on, guys. Appreciate it.
All right, we're going to wrap there for Derek and Chris. I am Frank. Thank you all for listening and watching Fantasy Baseball today. We'll be back again tomorrow with Scotty. Bye-bye.